Okay, and we are recording, we are live. So hello everyone, and welcome to the Workplace Wellbeing Ireland webinar. And it's our third webinar, and we're here again in partnership with Irish Life Health and AJ Products. So as I was saying, it's really fantastic to see so many people registered for the webinar today. I know a lot of us are suffering a little from Zoom fatigue. Understandable, there's a lot going on at the moment, but still almost 400 people have registered for our session today. So a big thank you to everyone. We do try and spread our webinars out like 3 or 4 weeks in between, but still thank you to everybody for signing up to the session today. So as always, we've tried as much as is possible to make the online experience as similar and interactive as our in-person events. So what can you do to take part? Well, you can answer all the poll questions. So we'll have a few poll questions spread throughout the session today. The chat functionality. So in your taskbar there, you'll see the chat functionality. Think of that as your networking. So use it to say hello and to interact with your fellow attendees. So you can still mingle in there and comment on what's going on. There's also the Q&A function you'll see in that taskbar. So that's a little different. That's kind of a private Q&A option, and it's only myself and our guest today, Barbara, can see that. So that's your opportunity to send a question directly to ourselves, and only myself and Barbara, as I said, can see that. So thanks to everyone who's submitted questions already. We will have a Q&A towards the end of our session. We'll allow plenty of time for that. And thanks to everyone who's sent in questions so far, and time permitting, we'll get to all our live Q&A questions as well. Now, an important question before we get started. Does everyone have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee? For my own part, I've got a glass of water with me, a bit of lime in there as well. So that's going to keep me going this afternoon. And maybe a pen and paper as well. Barbara's sessions are always really, really interactive and kind of get you thinking. So maybe a pen and paper might be useful as well. So I will kick off with a really brief introduction, and then we'll get into our session. So let me see if I can just, I'll share my screen here if I can. So I've just got about 3 slides to introduce our session today. So you should be able to see that. So that's us, that's our webinar today. I'll introduce myself briefly. So I set up the Workplace Wellbeing Ireland, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And I'm also the course director for the postgraduate certificate in workplace wellness at Tangent in Trinity College in Dublin. And actually, it's a really exciting time at the moment on the program because we have our live presentations tomorrow evening. So currently, the students are working in project teams on real world projects. So host organizations, real world companies have submitted challenges that they're facing, and the students are working on those projects at the moment. And tomorrow evening, they're going to be pitching and presenting back their findings to their host organization. So really exciting time on the program at the moment. I have a podcast as well, the Work Well podcast. I welcome you to listen to that. And actually our guest today, Barbara Brennan, we had a really wonderful conversation on that way back in episode 2. So I encourage you to check that out. And also a real passion of mine is Parkit. It's a social enterprise I started, and the big, hairy, audacious goal with Parkit is to bring free resistance training to every county and community in Ireland. So to be the resistance training equivalent of Park Run. And delighted to say we got back out. We took a break for a while, needless to say, with everything that was going on. But we got back outside and we're exercising again in 2 locations over the weekend, socially distant, with a maximum of 15 people in attendance. And that was some job actually to keep it to the 15. There was real kind of pent up energy and demand for people to get out back outside and back exercising. So really positive to see, and a really positive step in the right direction. The community itself then, why are we here today? Well, the community is all about sharing and learning and bringing people together. So whether you're self-employed, whether you work for a small company, or maybe you work for a large multinational, the whole idea is just to bring people, thought leaders, HR professionals, well-being champions together to share and to learn. And, whether that's mistakes made, to the successes, the obstacles overcome, And and everyone giving up their time, all the speakers giving up their time for free as well to do all of this. So just a real sharing and learning community. And the events also are completely free to attend when they're in person or whether they're the live webinars such as today as well. And they're free in large part thanks to our wonderful partners. So big shout out to our newest partners, Irish Life Health. So an absolute pleasure to partner with real thought leaders in this area. So Irish Life Health have been wonderful since they come on board, and Jacinta and the team have been an absolute pleasure to deal with. And I know Jacinta is online today and she's going to be in the chat. So make sure you say hello to Jacinta in the chat. And also, if there's any customers or would-be customers on the line as well, drop it if you have a specific question for Irish Life Health today. Drop that into the Q&A section, and I'll make sure that gets to Jacinta straight after the session today. And make sure you go to irishlifehealth.ie for any more details on the great work they're doing at this moment in time, supporting their clients. Shout out to AJ Products. So AJ have been with us since last year, and AJ are actually a really small company. And they know they've been, really struggling at this time, as have many small companies, but they've really stuck with us. They've been wonderful support. And they also just so happen to provide, one of Ireland's finest range of ergonomic home office furniture. So that's one thing that has really allowed them to shine at this moment in time. So any person looking to equip their home office should certainly check out ajproducts.ie. So, and a big shout out to Paul and Tanya and the entire team for supporting the community this year and last year also. Okay, that's enough for me for an introduction. So let's kick off with our first poll, shall we? And so our guest has helped me put together this really nice poll. So let me see if I'll stop sharing the presentation. And let me see if I can launch our poll. So we have 4 questions in the poll. So this is your opportunity now to kind of play a role in our interactive presentation. So you should be seeing those questions in front of you now. First question is just about kind of what best describes your role and your position. Is that coming up for everybody? It's coming up, is it? Excellent. Excellent, great stuff. Nice, and starting to see the answers coming through. Question 1, what best describes your role and position? And then from question 2 onwards, we're kind of a little bit more detail. So we're interested in the physical activity levels before and after lockdown. We're curious about wellness apps since lockdown began. And then we're also just looking at any change, any improvement in your mood as a result of maybe questions 2 and 3. So while we're waiting for you to answer those questions, I'm going to introduce our guest today. So our guest today really needs no introduction, but it would kind of be rude not to introduce her. So Barbara Louise Brennan is the program coordinator with Sea Change, and Sea Change is the National Stigma Reduction Partnership. And Barbara has been promoting mental health awareness and stigma reduction for a decade with Sea Change. She's a public speaker, a facilitator, and a trainer who has a passion to support people, communities, and workplaces to challenge their attitudes and change their culture for a more positive, inclusive, and open one. And I mentioned the postgraduate certificate in workplace wellness at Trinity at Tangent. And Barbara very, very recently came in to speak to us there, and she gave a really, really powerful session to the students on that evening. So I was really excited to bring her in to speak to the wider Workplace Wellbeing Ireland community. And after our last webinar as well, with Professor Niall Moynihan, we had a real focus on physical health. So it was wonderful then because a lot of questions and queries came back. Well, that was fantastic. Can we do something similar in the area of mental health? So Barbara, an absolute pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you so much. And for me, it's absolutely wonderful to be talking about one of my favorite topics. And it's funny because so many people quite often get this idea that a conversation about mental health is going to be really heavy and really difficult. And, they kind of wonder why I want to do this. And it's one of the most uplifting things I've ever done in my life. And while sometimes there are bits that are challenging and difficult, for the most part, I get to meet amazing people. I get to have great conversations. And it's amazing that quite often it's just reminding people of stuff that we actually know. And it's about how we interact with it a little bit differently, maybe maybe, and just change our perceptions. So I am very, very grateful, and certainly to connect with some of the communities that you have and to see these conversations sparking is just, it's incredible. So I'm really excited about today, and no pressure with that setup either. Thanks.
Absolutely zero pressure. Absolutely zero pressure. We know you're just going to share some details. As we always say, we're never kind of looking for experts here. It's just someone, we're looking for experiences, for lessons learned, and an understanding and a sharing, and that's all. And we know I've seen you speak quite a few times now, Barbara, so I know we're going to get that today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. So I know we had been talking about these polls, so will we have a little conversation about the poll before?
Can you see the results there? I'll end the polling now. The results, the people are still answering the question. I'll give another 10 seconds.
Give it another. So I tell you what about if you leave the poll going and I explain about what sea change is for anybody who doesn't know, and that'll give us about 2 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
Then we come back to the poll. Does that work?
Fantastic. Yeah.
So for anybody who isn't aware of sea change, it's sea change, SEE change.ie is our website. We're the National Stigma Reduction Programme, and we are a project of Shine. So Shine is an organisation that's 41 years old, and it supports people affected by mental ill health. The kind of work that we do is looking after people who are struggling with mental health difficulties in the like of counselling, peer support groups, one-to-one work, and the recovery-based model really. We also have family and peer groups as well, so it's a much wider conversation. And Shine have been doing work for 40 years, and 30 years ago they realised, we're doing all of this work in this community, but there is an additional thing that's there that is stopping people getting the help that they need, and that's stigma. And essentially that's where Sea Change was born. So Sea Change was a grassroots movement looking at how do we address the topic of stigma and reduce the stigma that exists around mental ill health. So basically we wanted to start conversations. It wasn't that we wanted to fix anybody, it wasn't that we wanted to give all the answers. We literally wanted to start a conversation. So what we started doing, and you will all have seen them, and I saw them in your photos, so thank you, Brian, your green ribbon. That is a project of Sea Change that we've been running for 8 years, and this is one of the simplest things to show people it's okay to have a conversation about mental health. And that's essentially what Sea Change do. We look at the language around mental health stigma, we look about educating people how to have a conversation, and we look at the topic. So I'm really excited to do that with you today. And really to get into the idea of that was the whole purpose of this poll, to see what are we thinking about while we're experiencing COVID, and how do we connect this idea of mental health with the regular stuff that we're doing? Because that's really what I'm interested in. How do we perceive our mental health? So how is your poll?
Yeah, it's gone really. We've a massive 83% of everyone online has completed the poll, which is really huge.
Is it still going? Do you want another minute?
No, I think we're good. I think we're good. So I will end the poll. So hopefully I'll be able to share the results with you now. So you should be able to see those. So
that's a HR, yeah.
The HR would be the majority. Two-thirds, clearly 2/3 have been more physically active, and then 1/3 less.
Yeah.
And then interesting breakdown on the
yeah.
apps is the walking, running, cycling. So the physical activity seems to be the most popular there.
Yeah. Really interesting.
Yep.
And the last one there, and this was one of the things that Brian and I discussed, this idea of, if we're going to make notice a change, is it an improvement change or a worse change? And so I suppose the reason, just to give you the background to why we really had the conversation around those particular questions, because you may be thinking, well, I thought this was mental health, why am I being asked about, sleep and yoga and running and those kind of things? And this is the thing, we want to let you know that your mental health is part of all of those things. So this idea that the more that we do, the more impact it has on how we think and how we feel, and that's our mental health. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that as we go, but it's really interesting to see that for the majority of people, they are more active, and that there is a correlation there at the bottom, that the higher number of people have seen an improvement in mental health as well, or this engagement piece and feeling slightly better. So this idea that your mood is better, that's your mental health. So isn't it interesting that the more we do and the more we engage in our physical activity, in our nutrition, in these different things, that it's having a positive impact. So in the same way then, I can see as well that there are a number of people who are less active. There's a number of people who haven't engaged in any of the wellness apps and things on. And there's a similar space there where people haven't noticed any. So I would be wondering, is it some of the people who haven't been engaging that haven't noticed a difference, or is it the people who are doing all the stuff and they still haven't noticed a difference?
Yeah.
So I might touch off some of those kind of changes as we're going through. But thank you to everybody for participating. Brian, do you want to make any comment on the poll?
No, just positive to see. It's certainly positive to see that certainly people are more active than before, which is interesting, because we were actually quite restricted in our movements. You know, the gyms are closed. So I think that's what people are actually making a positive difference there. They kind of having to go out of their way to make that extra effort to be more physically active. So I think that's a really positive sign.
It is. It's absolutely brilliant. And I think it's really interesting that people have had more time to engage in different things. But there is also the element that some people are still feeling this time famine, where it's like, well, I was supposed to have all this extra time, but now I'm having to do 10 times more. So where am I supposed to fit that in? So again, I'll touch off that a little bit later. I can see that we've got one or two into the Q&A section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to those. So please do drop some questions in there and I'll feed them through as we're going, and then anything I don't answer we'll get to at the end. So if that's okay for everybody, what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and look at sharing my slide.
I'll make you the host here, Barbara, so you can share your screen. Yeah.
Right.
So let me see. There you go. You should have that now.
Lots of good stuff when you can do it all virtually, isn't it?
Yeah, until something goes wrong, of course.
Until it goes wrong. There we are. So we are going to. So now you're seeing my lovely, all the stuff behind the screen. Okay, so today, because we're talking about the workplace piece, I'm going to lean a little bit more into that space rather than the general work that we do in Sea Change. So in Sea Change, we now have a 6-step program. So where this came from really was, we started doing workplace wellness and workplace conversations more really about mental health and stigma reduction back in 2013. So we launched our program 2013, and it was more like a presentation. And we looked at lots of different parts of mental health, and we looked at lots of different parts of the conversation around stigma and lots of the things that we could do with that. But what we saw was that some organizations connected with us, they did the training, and then they wanted to do more. But we also had other organizations that did the training and then had ticked the box, and that was it, mental health done. So for both of those purposes, so in the first instance, to support an organization who wanted to do more, that's where this 6-step program came in. And for organizations that just wanted to tick the box and be done with mental health, that's also where the 6-step program came in, that we needed them to engage more fully. So really what that 6-step looks like is the workshop with Sea Change, where we come and we do a workshop that looks at what is the language that we use around mental health, what's the topic, how do we understand that? Then looking at the stigma and language of stigma and the impact of that in our workplaces and the barriers that that creates. So that's really all what the piece that happens in that first workshop. And it really is looking at how do we have that conversation safely in our workplace, and then how do we cascade that across the whole organization. So that's where we then look to policy overhaul and implementation. And that really happens parallel with some of the other points here. So that's looking at, most organizations have health and safety policies. What they don't realize is that mental health should be part of that policy as well. And where that sits is under the disability section. So there is lots of stuff available there. And it's about how do we have a robust piece that people can go to and that's practical. So quite often it's the implementation side that is let down, because there's lots of organizations that have the policies there, but the implementation of it and the procedural part isn't there. And that's where we really push on that side to say, so talk me through that and how does that bit work? So the next 3 steps kind of go together. So the in-house mental health promotion, staff champions, and engaging your network. And really what I like to say is this piece about champions. Who doesn't want to be a champion? So that very first piece is really about somebody who is passionate about changing ideas about mental health, starting conversations and improving people's lives. And quite often that person is the person who gets engaged with the mental health promotion, the wellness training. You know, it might be bringing green ribbon into your organization. It might be setting up a yoga class. It might be having a coffee morning and having a conversation about mental health. It might be bringing a speaker in. There's lots of different things that can be done in addition to training. Number 5, then, engaging with your network. That's really how do people external to my organization view me in my organization and my organization itself? So how do they see that we're living good mental health? So again, that's about the external stuff. So is it that you've done mental health training? So if you have, are you sharing it on your social media? Do you have your certificates? If it's a walk-in business that people can come and interact with you in physical space, is there certificates that people can see? Is there something that people know about that? Is it on the bottom of your emails? So there's lots of ways that you can show that you are doing these things and being open to have those conversations. And then lastly, we are very excited that we now have a very fancy looking certificate that organizations get as part of that, so that they can have that on the wall and they can show it and they can share it with their colleagues. But as part of that, they also join the network and are able to have conversations with other organizations to see what is it that worked for them, what didn't work. So exactly like the whole purpose for you having these conversations, Brian, is to bring people together and see what works and what doesn't. And so really that's what that step is about. So as part of this program, we have a number of booklets that go with that. So when I was talking about the mental health policy, we have a policy document, and we also have a case law review that we would send to organizations to help them with that. And looking at this idea of what is it that you're going to do. So that action plan goes out to help organizations go through step by step. What is their journey going to look like in this culture change? We also have work done with the mental health law. So it's looking at what that looks like in your workplace. And then talking about partnering, IBEC shared their mental health and wellbeing line manager's guide, and that's available for everybody who signs up for the program as well. So it's really about what do we do and how do we do it. Some of the organizations that have done the training are on the screen there. So there's lots of different organizations. The most wonderful thing about this is that you're probably looking at these and seeing that there's some very different kinds of work going on there and very different kinds of jobs, I suppose. The amazing thing is that the conversation that we have is exactly the same regardless of where we go, because we're still dealing with people. We're still talking about the same issues are coming up. But the wonderful thing about that is the same things that help are also going to help across all of these. So that's one of the things that I find really, really interesting. So I'm going to just stop sharing for 1 second, just so that I can have a little conversation with you. I'm really sorry that you're seeing my screen now. My mouse doesn't really want to work for a second.
Barbara, can I just ask really quickly, because well, actually Claire has a question directly related to that. She's asking, what is the timeline for the 6-step pledge? And then what happens after step 6?
So that depends on the organization. So I suppose we would generally recommend to do it within 6 months, but some organizations may go to a year. So, and again, the reason that it will depend is whether there is the like of mental health policy in place, or whether they're building it from scratch, whether there is a wellness program there, whether there's a wellness coordinator, whether it's somebody who is dedicated to doing this and it's part of their role, or is it additional from a voluntary point of view. So that timeline can change, and it's really down to the organization. So their action plan is on their timeline. So we would recommend that it's done in 3, 6 or 9 months, but then we would work with the organization to have that conversation. From a point of view of after the pledge, those 6 steps, we would look at, in the following year or 2 years down the line, a lot of organizations come back and repeat it to do new training with new staff that have come in, or do an upgrade. There's also additional things that you can do. It's just that those are the first steps to get organizations to start engaging. Okay. So I think if anybody has any more questions about the particular workplace program itself, they're more than welcome to email me directly. It's coordinator@seechange.ie, or you can send it to workplace@seechange.ie. There's no problem, and I can send out the basic info and our booklets on that. Just to say to everybody as well, our workplace program is currently on hold because of COVID, and it's a person-to-person training. We are building online training, and we hope to be online in the next number of weeks, but we are currently not facilitating that program just because of COVID at the moment. So again, I can send out information on that. That's not a problem. So so before I talk about stigma and stigma reduction, really, and I'm conscious there's a couple of other questions that I'll come back to those if that's okay. Yep. I'd really like to get everybody on board with this idea of what mental health is. And so if I could really get people to think about, and I know that for this purpose, and for time as well, rather than getting everybody to comment and come back, I'm just going to assume that most of you are going to put up your hands for these, and obviously I can't see you either. So I'm going to ask you if you've ever been happy in your life, if you've ever been sad, if you've ever been upset about something, if you've ever been pissed off. So that's more than just angry, like proper pissed off. That's like two hands rather than just putting up one hand. What about disappointed? What about absolutely joyous? Something amazing happened. What about excited about something? What about fearful? Something has gone wrong, or you're worried that something is going to happen, and you're fearful because of that. So what about worry itself? So let's stick with worry for just 1 second. Have you ever worried for 2 minutes so that you couldn't focus on anything else? Have you ever worried for long enough that you couldn't concentrate on what you were doing if you're trying to focus on something else? Have you ever worried long enough that you've got a headache, or that you've got a pain in your stomach, or that it has prevented you from eating because maybe you feel a little bit like the butterflies and kind of that uncomfortable feeling? Or maybe you've got neck tension from it, or maybe you even lost sleep over it. So all of those things are to say, if you've experienced any of those things that I've just mentioned, and it doesn't matter in what capacity, how big or small, or for how long, that proves that you have mental health. And this is where we really need to get this understanding of what mental health is in the first place. So our mental health is our thoughts, it's our feelings, and it's our behaviors. It's how we combine all of those things and how we experience the world. What we see as a stigma reduction program is that when we say the words mental health, what people normally hear is mental illness. And when people hear mental illness, they also jump to severe and enduring mental illness, and they have a perception of a person who has dropped out of life, somebody who is most likely on heavy medication, who is possibly hospitalized. And then if we go to the stigma end of things, we may also jump to the conclusion that this person is not able to do anything else, or they may possibly even be dangerous. So that's where we start looking at perceptions, and we start looking at this idea of discrimination and that part of stigma. So when we're really looking at mental health and mental illness, we need to divide the two and say that they are two different things. And that if we were to mind our mental health, so when we started, we had this poll about, you know, your nutrition, your sport level, I suppose, or your activity level. Are you engaging in meditation apps or those different things? What well-being things are you doing? So here's the thing. When we started having this conversation, Brian said that I'm the coordinator of Sea Change, which I am, and I absolutely adore my job. If he had said to you at the very start that I'm a suicide survivor and that I spent 15 years on incredibly heavy medications, nearly 50 a day, in and out of hospital, minimum stay was 4 months, I think our conversation would have been very different from the start. So here's the thing. People can and do recover from mental illness, even severe and enduring mental illness. And that's something that we don't know about enough. It's something we don't talk about enough. And it's something that stigma has an awful lot to do with. So the thing about stigma is it's this idea of prejudging somebody. So deciding before we know the information, or deciding before we know the person, that they are different and worse than. So here's the thing. If I had just said that 10 or 12 years ago I had broken my leg, most likely you'd probably be wondering, well, why is she telling us she broke her leg? Like, do you want a medal for that? Like, really, you know, you'd want to kind of get over yourself. It's not that big a deal. But if I told you that 12 years ago I was on a life support machine for trying to end my life, that's not something that has no impact. And if anything, it's something that you will probably never forget. And further to that, it means that you will probably already start thinking different things about me. You may assume what my life was like before, or what my decisions were around that time, or what my capability is because I had that experience. And that's the bit that we really speak about when we talk about stigma, because stigma has this thing that I am less than, not my illness, not the experience that I had, but me personally. Because I've experienced a mental health difficulty, it means that therefore I am less than. As a human being, I am now less. I am now worse. How is that true? How is that possible? And that's the bit that I love about my job, that I get to talk about this and put it out there and say, you know, maybe if we understood things a little bit differently and we changed the tone of the conversation, or we looked at our language that we use, or maybe we understood where the stigma thing came from. Because here's the thing, I'm working in this organization for nearly 10 years, looking at changing perceptions about mental health and changing perceptions about stigma. And I have yet to meet a person who has learned and gone on a course to do stigma to somebody. And yet stigma exists. It's one of these things that is just there, and it comes from the whispers of our grannies, you know, and the house on the hill, and, you know, she suffers with her nerves and those kind of things. So it's those things that when we start thinking about mental illness, even though we've asked about mental health, we start thinking mental illness, we start hearing those voices, we start remembering things that we've seen in the news or in movies with this idea of psycho and difficult and crazy and frightening and dangerous. And we assume those things. So when we are then approached by a loved one or a colleague and they bring this idea of mental illness to us, we assume all of those things, even if we don't know that to be true. And here's the thing, that perceptions and our prejudgment, even though we don't engage with them too much, they're there anyway. I have a friend who has a physical illness. She has Crohn's. And so when I found out that she had Crohn's, I did what everybody does. I went on Google and I found out so much information. And about a week later, I went for coffee with her and she said, okay, give it to me. What have you got? It's like, what are you talking about? And she said, I want to know all of the stuff that you've learned by going to Google about me and about my body and the impact on me. And I'd also like you to give me all of the advice. So we had a really interesting chat and I went through what I had learned. And then she said, well, that's great because it doesn't apply to me at all, because I am one of those really weird people who is the one in like 2 million that doesn't get any of that. So well done for wasting your time. And if you just asked me, we could have had a different conversation and I could have just told you. So to put that in the perspective of the mental health bit, no two people will ever have the same experience. And I guarantee you that when I talked about sadness earlier on and I talked about, you know, joy or disappointment, our version of that is different. How we cope with it is different. How it impacts us is different. So when we start putting an illness on top of that, the response is going to be different. And if we then add stigma to that, that's also going to add another layer. So most often the way that we break stigma and we make the biggest difference is to have a conversation and to ask. The biggest thing that we see around stigma is fear, and that is the most reason why people don't have a conversation. So I'm going to just share my slides with you again just for 1 second, just to show you a couple of words that we would see on a regular basis. I'm sorry that this won't play straight away. So, oh, went straight back to the beginning. No, it didn't. Okay, so when we started our conversation, if I had started saying to you words like psycho and lunatic and nut job and madzer, I would imagine that some of you would wonder how I got a job leading our National Stigma Reduction Programme. The thing is that these are words that we have taken over the last number of years in running our stigma reduction work. The thing I would like to say is that I have seen a difference. So quite often we don't see these words being used very much anymore. And what we do see is that people are slightly more uncomfortable now seeing those words or hearing them. And quite often we have an adverse reaction. So if somebody is using language like that, we might feel uncomfortable. So that's showing us that things are starting to change in society. The interesting thing is that I saw a poll done by Headline, who's our sister company, and they look at media monitoring, and they also look at education journalists on mental health, and particularly looking at mental illness and the portrayal of that. And they have seen that the words crazy and psycho have actually peaked during COVID. And here's one of the things. When we're talking about language, it's really easy for these words to creep in. But it's also really easy to change them once we're aware. So one of the things, for example, the word crazy, I have seen it a huge amount lately. And it's usually in the context of, I've had a crazy day. I'm crazy busy. You know, isn't this COVID thing crazy? Those are the kind of conversations that I'm hearing. And it is very normal for people to say that. The thing is that a lot of times people don't realize the impact of somebody saying that. Maybe if somebody has been unwell and has had that language put on them, to then suddenly hear people using that words, that kind of language can be really difficult. So the interesting thing also is the impact that it has on ourselves. So if I'm talking to somebody and they're saying, I have a crazy day ahead of me, or I've just had a crazy day, that feels entirely out of control. And it starts feeling like anxiety, and it starts feeling like an uncontrollable thing. If we change just that one word to maybe challenging. I've had a challenging day. Challenging could be anything to, it was absolutely horrendous and really difficult. And I don't know how I'm going to reach that challenge, to, it was challenging, it pushed me, but I rose to it. either way, challenging has changed the perception that we have, and it changes our physiological response to what's happening as well. So this idea of how am I engaging with this language that I'm hearing, or what am I saying and how can I change that myself? And there's the thing as well, if we are aware of some of the things that other people are saying, is it okay for us to pull them up and say, well, you know, are you aware of what you just said there? So sometimes it's important that we do, but it's the how. So quite often, if I hear somebody who's using language that I'm not really that delighted with, and I would like to help them to change or to be aware of it, I might say, that's really interesting what you've said, or it's really interesting how you've said that. Or are you aware of that particular word? Or can you repeat that? And quite often when you ask somebody to repeat it, they'll think about it a second time. So really it is about engaging with our language and seeing what it is that we're saying and how and why. So this idea that words matter, really we're looking at stigma, we're looking at what is it, why is it important, and where does it happen? The thing is that actually stigma doesn't discriminate. It picks everybody all of the time. So we see stigma show up in communities, in families, in workplaces. It is literally everybody's business. And this is also the thing, that every one of us can make a change. So when we want to know how can we make a change, we start looking at, is it that we need to educate ourselves a little bit better? Is it that we need to have more conversations with people who know about this? Is it that we need to challenge our own perceptions? And how do I do that? So the biggest piece that Sea Change looks at is this social contact theory, this idea that by having conversations and including people with lived experience of mental ill health, that is the easiest way to have this conversation and realize that we're all human and we all have experiences. So really that piece is what we look at. Again, I'll go back to the green ribbon. That is one of our most successful campaigns, and it really is about starting that conversation and saying, how do we move this barrier? How do we change this together? And then really looking at, what more can I do? So I'm going to just put this slide up just for a quick second, and then I'm going to take it down and just go through another one or two pieces. If anybody wants to get more information, you are most welcome to reach out to us. And our email address is info@seachange.ie. Sorry, my mouse has completely disappeared now. So I mentioned about anxiety a couple of times. So I have another poll that I would really love to get an answer on before I go into the next section, because I'm also conscious of your time. But again, this is about engaging with how do we have a conversation and our perceptions about mental health and our perceptions about mental illness. So what I'd really like to think about is, if I was to ask you to sit with somebody and you think that they're having a difficulty with something. So the first question I'm going to ask you is about having a conversation. Isn't that the first one you've got there, Brian?
I think so. Would you believe, because you're the host now, I think you'll have to share
Oh,
that.
I'm gonna.
Yeah, I don't have the option anymore.
I tell you what, I'll make you, because I'm finished with my slides
Okay.
now, so I will make you the host. I will just change the
Very
host.
good.
A lot easier for me.
Oh yeah. Okay, that's back. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So the question that I'm going to ask you before we even get to diagnosing or helping or any of that stuff, you have to open your mouth first. So I'd like to know, if we're going to have a conversation about mental health, this is going to be the first question. So Brian, if you want to go ahead with that first.
Sure. Okay, so that should be showing up now. So the question is, what would stop me having a conversation with somebody who I knew had a mental health issue? And as it says there, it is multiple choice, so you can select more than one option.
Yeah,
if you wish.
And just for people's interest, that where these answers came from are answers that I've seen over the last number of years, some of them more so than others. So we just thought we would throw in a few that we had seen. There's a couple of people that can't see the poll there on your chat there, Brian.
Okay. Well, I mean, we've got 120 responses so far. So I don't know. Maybe it's the. Is it the browser potentially that Arena and Dermot are using? It could be that.
Okay, so apologies to those of you who can't see. I don't know if you can't see it. I don't know if you click into the chat function, it might pop up there, because I know mine did when I had the chat open. Or maybe it may be behind your window possibly. So again, I see a number of comments there looking on advice around sleeping and a number of different Q&A pieces. So we will get to those in a couple of minutes. Okay, so are you happy that your poll is?
Yeah, we're good. We're 73% have replied, 75%. So if you're happy, I'll end the poll.
So we'll go back because I have another two, and I'm very conscious of time. So thank you to everybody who.
I'll end and I'll share the results.
So let's have a look and see what people said. Okay, now isn't that really interesting? Okay, so 77% said that they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Interestingly, only 1% said it's not my problem. And I would love to know if anybody felt really uncomfortable, because personally, I know that I felt uncomfortable with that question. I wrote it, I put it there, and I didn't like it. That says to me that my attitude has changed. So the other thing that is really interesting, I don't want to be associated with mental health problems. So that's really interesting. Not one person clicked that as an option. So the biggest reasons is fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of upsetting them, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to help, and then not knowing about training and not knowing where to send. So the not knowing where to send isn't the biggest deal. Not being trained isn't the biggest deal. Fear of saying the wrong thing is. And so here's the thing. Most of the time when we think about saying the wrong thing, most often we say nothing. So the biggest thing when we talk about stigma is that we say stigma equals silence. So here's a very strong descriptor of what silence does or how we interact with that. So if I was to say to all of you, we've got 187 people on at the moment, and the two of us, so we're on nearly 190 people in this group right now. So if I asked every single one of you to give me 1 minute of your time, and I put it in the context of I came out of psychiatric care yesterday, and that I had been suicidal up to that point. And I would like, after this workshop, that you would spend 1 minute of your time speaking with me. I would be interested to know how many people out of that would actually have that minute, or how many would go, do you know what, there's nearly 200 people here, she won't notice if I don't talk to her. So now I'm going to put it in the context of, what if every single one of you had that thought, but you didn't know the others did? So in that minute, when you chose not to have a conversation, what you also did was you sucked every other conversation out. I never once said that we had to have a conversation about mental health. I never said we had to talk about mental illness. I never said we had to talk about hospital or suicide or any of that stuff. So in your fear of, how do I talk to this person? I don't want to upset her. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I just don't know what to say. We didn't talk about the weather. We didn't talk about work. We didn't talk about the cute guy in the coffee shop. We didn't talk about clothes. We didn't talk about kids. We didn't talk about TV. We talked about nothing. And that's the problem. That quite often when people are afraid to say something because of a mental health difficulty or a perceived mental health difficulty, what they are doing is removing every conversation from that person. So now what happens is the person perceives that people don't want to talk to them. And now we have two different kinds of stigma going on. We've got public stigma, and then we've also got the self-stigma. So self-stigma is where somebody perceives that they're going to be treated worse than and less than because of the mental health difficulty. And so they change their behavior. So in this instance, I might see, well, nobody wants to talk to me. It's because I'm a bad person. It's because they think I'm crazy. It's because they're going to say something horrible to me. And I feel horrible because all these people are standing here and nobody will talk to me. So I just won't go out. Or maybe I start getting anxiety and panicking because that's my experience every time I go out. So now I'm just going to stop going out. And in isolating myself, that then creates a new host of problems. So this is where we really start seeing how stigma is alive and well. And when we say to people, do you realize by not speaking to somebody that that's stigmatizing that person? Most people feel quite sad about that, or they feel guilty about it. And it's because we've never thought about it in that way. So here's the thing, it isn't about having a mental health conversation. It isn't about being trained. It isn't about having all the answers. It's about saying, how are you? It's about saying, I've noticed you've been a little bit quiet lately. Can I get you a cup of tea? And this is the amazing thing. In Ireland, we drink buckets of tea. And most people know how to make a cup of tea. Now, I will be honest and say, it has been told to me on multiple occasions that I make a very poor cup of tea. And in my house, I don't have dairy. So my poor dad has to bring his tea with him. And he also brings his own milk. So we have a huge amount of laughs over the tea issue in my house. But here's the thing. When you make it with care and you make it with love, you start the conversation and you can do something with that. So to prove that point about not knowing what's going on and maybe not having the answers, I'd love to know a really quick answer to the next question. So if you wouldn't mind putting the next question up, Brian, and this is going to be a really, really quick one because I'm really conscious of time.
Dermot was anticipating it's what's the best tea, but it actually isn't. It's launching now. So the question is, and hopefully everyone can see this one, what symptoms do you recognize relating to a heart attack?
And I promise I will relate this back to mental health. I know you're probably wondering, what is she asking us this for now?
Yeah. And again, this one is multiple choice. So you can, if there might be more than one symptom you might wish to choose.
Okay, and you don't have to have done training. It's just if you're aware of anything, if you've ever heard of anybody going through the experience of a heart attack or a stroke, or you've ever seen an ad, anything that you're aware of, just tick the box. And then I'm very quickly, as soon as we finish this one, can we throw the other one up and then do the answers for the two? Or do you first?
I think we might need to share the results of this one first, I think.
Okay, that's okay.
We might quickly do that, will we? Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
So I think we're just at the 75% mark again.
Let's go for it.
We go for it, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Lovely. Share the results. There we go.
Okay, so pain in the chest. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Pounding heart makes sense. Pain or numbness. Okay, so basically every single one of those people have heard of. So difficulty breathing, the pain or numbness in limbs, and the pain in the chest were the three highest. The next two were sweating and panic. Okay, so that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you for that. So if you wouldn't mind answering my last question then, which is also in the form of a poll, and if you wouldn't mind answering at the same kind of speed, that would be amazing. Okay.
So what symptoms do you recognize relating to a panic attack?
So again, if you've never had a panic attack, this is a guesswork possibly, what you might be aware of, or what you would imagine somebody might feel if they were having a panic attack, if you've never experienced one before. So if you haven't, just a guess is absolutely fine.
It's great engagement here. We're already over the 70%. So
excellent. Thank you so much for your speech, everybody. I appreciate you. Okay, so how are we on?
We're comfortably, we're approaching 80% here.
Wow.
Actually, we've gone over the 80% mark. Fantastic response.
Amazing. So let's have a look and see what people think about that one then. Okay, so again, so feeling a panic was the first one, and that's the highest. That's really interesting. So most of you would recognize most of these symptoms much more strongly. So feeling a panic, pounding heart, difficulty speaking or tingling or pain in the limbs. And difficulty breathing were the top ones there. Okay, so thank you for doing that. So the reason that I wanted to do that, and I'm going to be really mean now, because did anybody realize that those two answers, they were exactly the same for both? So here's the reason I did that, was because I wanted you to realize that whether somebody's having a heart attack or somebody's having a panic attack, the symptoms could feel exactly the same. And here's the other thing, it is not up to you to know which it is, because if you assume they're having a panic attack and they're having a heart attack, that's not ideal. But equally, if they're only having a panic attack and it's not a heart attack, and you know you've now got them going off in an ambulance there, you know, there's lots of different impacts by us not understanding or not knowing from a medical perspective. So the interesting thing is, again, I mentioned earlier that everybody is individual and our responses can be quite unique. So this idea of needing to know what it is and how we can help and what we do and why and how to be trained, that's not the relevant part. So the relevant part is that whether somebody's having a panic attack or somebody's having a heart attack, you know, they need assistance and they need help. And somebody from a medical profession most likely is the most fitting to deal with the symptoms of those things. What we can do in the meantime is we can ask somebody, has this ever happened to you before? Is there anything I can do right now? What would help you right now? So again, that conversation, how do we have a conversation? How do we help somebody in this moment and let go of this thing of, I'm not trained, I don't know how. So those are some of the biggest things. And here's the other thing about anxiety. Quite often when people are anxious, we do experience that muscle tension, the tingling in the fingers or in the limbs, or heart pounding, dry mouth, all of those things. The thing is that also people now, because of COVID, are experiencing an anxiety and mild depression more than ever before, and sometimes for the first time maybe, and it might be overwhelming. So this idea that people are maybe more irrational than usual, or they're a little bit ratty, or they're a little bit weepy, or their brain fog is going on, this is all related to the level of anxiety that we have. So it's about this human piece of what's happening for you. How can I help right now? What would help you in this minute? And I think that's where the work that we do is really allowing people to have that conversation. It's not about fixing somebody. It isn't about having all the answers. And I found it really interesting that most people were saying that not having the answers of where to send somebody from a support point of view, that would stop them. So here's the thing, for anybody who is on this call who has not got a clue where they should send them, today, when you get off this call, you need to go online and look. So the suggestions that I have are yourmentalhealth.ie. That is a county by county registration that has a list of everything that is available. It's done by the HSE. You've also got the Samaritans, and that's samaritans.org. Their phone number is 116123. If you've never rung them, I would suggest that it is a really good exercise so that when you have a conversation, not if, when you have a conversation with somebody about ringing them, it isn't a matter of I should ring the Samaritans. It's then a matter of, well, I rang them and actually they were really nice. And here's a few questions that they asked me at the beginning that I wasn't expecting, but now I know why. That changes the tone of the conversation and changes how we're going with that. And I think when we start looking at how do we have these conversations, that changes the tone and the topic totally from this idea of fear. So looking back, just because again I'm conscious of time, I want to just address some of the questions that you've asked. So looking at, do you think that whilst the stigma has reduced, mental health and mental health awareness, it continues around mental illness? So I do think that stigma has reduced so far as our language has changed. We have this perception that some of the language that we use is now wrong and we don't use it, which is great. We are also having mental health conversations. So the fact that you have all given your time and have come on today, we are having those conversations. We are also having a lot more that we see on TV or in the paper. So it's a much more hot topic at the moment. However, the me and I in the conversation is still not there yet. So people still have this fear. So I do think that there is a stigma, particularly around mental illness, because the mental health bit we're starting to get, but we need to understand a little bit more about why, if somebody's struggling with mental illness, that we're still treating them differently and less than, because that's not okay. So
Barbara, can I jump in? There's a question that a few questions came in over email. Would it be okay if I asked
oh please,
yeah,
because obviously I can't see them.
I know, yeah. So Amanda had a great question. She was asking, how can organizations equip people managers to be able to support their teams during this time of change, at the moment, and with the transition back to the office over the coming months? Because as she said herself, it's often easier to spot difficulties employees are having when we're working face to face, and it can be more challenging when we're working remotely.
Yeah, and absolutely great and a question. And the point is that we're all in this space. So let's assume that everybody is going through difficulty. Let's assume that everybody is anxious. So on that, it's a matter of maybe showing the way and saying, here are the things that we're going to do. And let me go through it with you as my team. So for example, I would be having conversations with my team at the moment about returning to work and returning to the building and saying, this is what my organization is putting in place. Does this make sense to you? Is there anything else that you would need right now? Or what would help you to return on the day that you have to go back? Are there different things? What other supports do you have? And then equally, when we're checking in, every single meeting that we have a check-in rather than a check-up at the start. So we give up to 10 minutes at the very beginning of every single meeting just to check in on a human basis, because maybe I'm the only person that's actually asked that. In all these video calls that we're doing and in all the Zoom fatigue that we've got, it's really important to have that connection. So again, it goes back to the individual and it goes back to asking questions. So it's about communication first, second and third every time.
Fantastic. And I was reminded earlier as well by the conversation you brought up around tea, a cup of tea. And I think it's Keating Construction they've gone through a lot of kind of mental health training throughout the organization. And they actually just have an understanding, like almost like a code word throughout the company, that if you do need to have a conversation around mental health, you just say to someone, would you fancy tea and a biscuit? So tea and a biscuit is their kind of almost code word. And so that's something you can do online, in person as well. So I thought that was an interesting idea that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very relevant. And I think the thing is that while there's a lot happening organizationally, sometimes it is a matter of on your particular team. So for example, on my team, I instigated yoga. So we started off by having tea and a catch up a couple of times a week. And, we were realizing that we needed something additional to that. So I started doing yoga classes where we went and we found a YouTube video that we shared and we did it at the same time and we had a chat about it afterwards. And that opened the door to being a little bit more vulnerable about, maybe saying, well, actually, I'm tired or I'm sore today because I've been sitting at the desk or these things, which then in time leads this trust space to say, actually, I'm not having a great day. So it is about having continuous conversations and creating that space and knowing that, we're all in this similar space together. And I do think it is leading by example, but always checking in and following up is the other thing. So here's the thing, if somebody asks a question and you don't have the answer and you don't know, rather than that silence and being afraid of saying the wrong thing, to say to somebody, I don't have the answer, let me find out and come back to you, and I'll come back to you by tomorrow at lunchtime or whenever that is. So follow up is really, really important.
Yeah, great advice there. Now we're coming up to the hour, so I know a lot of people will have to drop off and go to other calls, other meetings, maybe even have their lunch. But I don't know, Barbara, are you okay for 5 more minutes just to answer a couple of questions? Yeah, that'd be fantastic. And for anyone that needs to drop off, I'll be sending a recording of our conversation so you can catch up on these final questions after that. So there was another couple that came in over email as well that I just thought were really important. So Christina had asked, so her question was, in Ireland or the Western world, there's a culture of looking to the doctor to solve all ailments through medicines. So she's asking, what advice would you give to someone who would like to support a family member or a friend who is struggling with their mental health, even though this person is not at the point of recognizing this? Apparently they're still looking for physical problems.
Okay. So firstly, there's two things. So firstly, I'm going to go back to the poll that we did at the beginning. So people recognized all these different things. So eating, sleeping, getting out into fresh air, doing those activities, they noticed a difference in how they were feeling and how their mood was. That is the same for every single person. And here's the thing, quite often, so I'm going to ask if anybody has watched Netflix while we have been in lockdown. I would imagine the answer is a resounding yes, exactly. And for how many of the people who are watching have either watched a movie that has gone on late because they were late finishing up and they just needed the time to come down, or that they watched a second episode, even though it was going to bring them to 12 or maybe 1 o'clock, so that's essentially binge watching. But what it's also doing is eating into your sleep time. So sometimes we make these choices that are not particularly good, that have a negative impact. So now the next day we're going to be more tired, we're going to be cranky, we're going to maybe make less choices, we're probably going to be looking for sugary food, those kind of things. So we always start with what can you physically do as well? The second thing is I made reference to a couple of times about not trying to fix somebody. So here's the thing, you cannot make a decision for another person. You cannot fix another person. And essentially, if that person isn't in the place where they are engaging or they want to engage, that may be their choice. So it is about, in that space, rather than how do I get them to engage with this, how do I support them to find their own way to it? So we can help them to find information, but the biggest thing actually is to sit with the person, to let them know you're there, to be encouraging to them. So for example, at times when I was massively unwell and maybe I wasn't able to engage with some of those things, my mum or my friend would come and sit in the room with me and we would just read together. And then one of them would turn around and say, I'm going to go for a walk, come on. And I'd say, I really don't want to go. And they'd say, look, just put your shoes on, we'll go. And if we're 5 minutes down the road and you don't want to stay, we'll come back. So sometimes it's really the very, very small things, and it's about showing that you're showing up and, consistently checking in with the person rather than trying to fix them with something. But from a point of view of our health, it should always be a holistic view of everything. And for some people, medication is a necessary part of their life. And it isn't that, all medication is bad and that nobody should take it. For some people, it is very helpful and very necessary. So it might be about finding the level there of, maybe I need to take a little bit of medication, and I need to change my sleep, and I need to look at my diet and cut out a bit of sugar or wheat and those kind of things. And maybe I need to engage with some more activities. That might be going to a book club, or it might be going to the movies, as well as some of the other stuff from a physical perspective.
Sure. Great answer. Thank you, Barbara. And maybe just one more that came in from the email that caught my attention was, it came from Michael, and that was, what do you see as the most significant word danger is used or challenge to companies who do not embrace managing their employees' mental well-being?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I think for organizations that don't have those conversations and they don't put things in place, you're going to be creating that fear culture that basically I cannot bring this to my manager. So maybe if I can't have a conversation with my manager, I can't let them know that I'm struggling. So in the long term, it's going to impact on my work. So my productivity is going to go down. And then in the long run, I might actually go out sick because I haven't been able to have those kind of conversations. So not just the impact on me, but the impact on the work that's being done. And then additionally, if my mood is continuously going down over time, the impact on my colleagues as they're either in the same space as me, that we're having this, the mood element of it hitting off other people, or even the element of the workload that maybe they're having to pick up the slack there because I'm not doing it. So there are huge benefits to engaging with people and bringing them on a different journey and having that open conversation and being supportive. And it isn't about fixing everything. Quite often it's about, what else have you got in your life? Outside of work, what else are you doing in that personal responsibility? So it's not that organizations have to do all of it. It isn't. But being supportive definitely has benefits. And even from a monetary point of view, it's worth doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well said. Will we go back just one or two more, will we, if you have the time, Barbara?
Yeah, I saw a really interesting one from Grace there looking at the words mental health, and I think that is a very relevant thing. So so Grace was saying that some people don't want to use the terminology because of stigma, and other people think that, so either the words are okay or they aren't okay. So here's the thing, you're never going to know if you don't have the conversation in the first place. And I also think, depending on who you're having the conversation with, sometimes it is very relevant to say, I'm not quite sure what language I should be using. So for example, I don't particularly like the word severe and enduring mental illness. And yet it's an experience of mine. I had severe and enduring mental illness for a very long time, but currently I don't really know any other language to say exactly that, because it is a descriptor of what it is. The other challenge that we have is, if we start removing all the language around this, we're not actually breaking stigma around it. What we're doing is we're just changing direction and we're taking the language away. So what we need to be doing is normalizing the conversation and normalizing the language. But if there is somebody that obviously is very offended or very upset or finds some of the specific language difficult because of their experience, that's a slightly different conversation, and you need to be having that with them, to be saying, well, what language do you suggest, or what way would you say it? So again, it's about this conversation. How do we have those conversations, and what does that look like? So I think it really is interesting about what is it that we're doing and what are we saying, but why? And I think the why is the bigger part of the conversation, because quite often, sometimes people might say something and not realize the impact of what they've said. And it's not that it's a pointed thing. Maybe they're getting to a different point where they're trying to learn about it. So for example, I have a friend who quite often says the wrong thing, but she's so inquisitive that when she asks me questions and she goes digging for stuff, she eventually gets there. But I've had to realize that actually it's nothing to do with me and the language that I'm not particularly comfortable on. I also need to help her with that. So sometimes she would say something. So let's say, for example, we'd talk about somebody committing suicide. I would say to her, look, if you don't mind, I'm not really comfortable with that terminology because it's not against the law and it's not against God and it's very stigmatizing. So here are some of the other options that you could say: died by suicide, took their own life. And we have a conversation. And that's how we start changing the whole landscape around language, that we start getting into it and saying, why am I using that language? What could I use instead? Or what do you think I should use, or what works for you? So again, going back to just communication and conversation every time.
Fantastic. And I think from Grace's point of view and her colleagues, it's a positive step that they're actually having that conversation in the first place, that it's out there and they're discussing it.
Absolutely, yeah. 100%.
Okay. One final question, very conscious of your time. But Niamh came in with a question very early on in the discussion, and it was around the time we introduced the poll around the physical health as well. And so she's asking, if due to poor mental health, a person does not feel motivated to engage in physical activity, but physical activity helps with poor mental health, how does one break that cycle?
Yeah, what an amazing question.
Yeah.
And being honest, that is part of what changed my life. So I had that all my life, you know, you should just go for a walk, you should just do this, you should just do that. And I remember so many times saying, I would if I could, I would if I felt like it. I literally have no energy, I am not motivated. And the amount of arguments that it caused by people saying, come on, do this, or, you know, you're not even bothered, you want, you know, you're not looking after yourself, how do you expect yourself to get better? So there's all of those layers. So what I started doing was this idea of fake it till you make it. So, and now the way I live it now is this idea of one task or 5 minutes. So I will do something. If I really don't want to do it, I'll say, right, I'm going to do it for 5 minutes or until this task is complete. So maybe my task is going for a jog around the block, or maybe my task is to do a couple of stretches, or maybe it's to open all the windows in my house, whatever it is. If it's less than 5 minutes, then it's done, that's fine. If it's only 5 minutes, then I'm allowed after 5 minutes go, yeah, I still don't really want to do that. But most often, once I've started doing it, I start engaging with it and it doesn't feel so bad. And then I'll say, well, maybe I'll do another 5 minutes. So it's about the very first step, and also about how many barriers are there. So the more decisions you have to make about that thing, the more likely your brain is to step in and go, nope. So for example, I go for a walk every single morning. I leave my shoes at the front door. I leave the key where I can get it. I have everything lined up so that I do not have to make any decisions in the morning. Because if I did, my head would turn around and go, it's a little bit cold. Oh, I'm kind of tired. Oh, I don't really want to go. So I literally remove every single possible time that my brain is going to say no to me. And you know, there's a lot of studies done on that, this idea of helping us to shortcut to the slightly better behavior. So I would really suggest this idea of trying to do it in small increments, also take away the pressure of the bigger picture and the guilt of if I didn't do it, because that's a very hard thing, that we're very judgmental and we're very hard on ourselves for not doing those things. So if we could remove the judgment and remove the guilt, but then put some level of reward in, whether it's, if it's a really difficult thing and you've been really struggling, is it that, you know, I'd rather sit here and have a really nice coffee. So actually, what about, I'll go for a walk for 5 minutes and then I'm going to have an even nicer coffee than I would have made myself. I'm going to make it in my favorite mug and I'm going to make myself a fancy cappuccino instead of just this, you know, the granules out of the regular coffee thing. So it is about just shifting your behaviors ever so slightly. And I'd really recommend looking at some of the behavioral change things that you can find. Even YouTube has some amazing videos on behavioral change for some of that particular piece.
Excellent. Barbara, listen, thanks so much. You know, we covered so much in this period of time, but as always, it feels like we're still only getting started as well, doesn't it? Like we could speak for another few hours, but very conscious of your time. Thanks so much for sharing so much there this afternoon. That really is wonderful. So remind us again, where can people go to find out more about yourself?
So if they want to connect with me through Sea Change, they're going to go to seechange.ie. That's SEE change.ie. They can reach me directly at coordinator at seechange.ie. If it's workplace that they're interested in, they can email workplace@seechange.ie or info@seechange.ie. And I'm on LinkedIn, Barbara Louise Brennan on LinkedIn, if they want to connect with me there, or follow me and find out more information. So equally, if anybody has additional questions in relation to any of this, please feel free to contact me, and if I can help, I'm more than happy to.
Fantastic. And there's some lovely comments and thank yous coming in there on the chat. So thank you to everybody for that. I'll just finish up very, very quickly with our final couple of slides that should be coming up on your screen there. So I want to say a few thank yous as well. Massive thanks to Barbara for giving up her time for this. Really inspirational and powerful message as always. So thank you, Barbara. If people want to continue, a few people were asking about Barbara and I had a really great conversation on the Work Well podcast as well. So go and check out that. I think it's episode number 2 is our conversation, and lots of other interesting conversations there. You can go and find out more through that website there. Huge thanks again to our partners, to Irish Life Health, to Jacinta and the team. And as I mentioned, if anyone has a question for Irish Life Health and you want to speak directly to Jacinta, pretty much the head of workplace wellbeing at Irish Life Health, real thought leaders in this area, you can drop me a line and I will pass it directly to Jacinta and the team. Same goes for AJ Products as well. Drop me a line, I'll put you in touch with Paul and Tanya there. And big thanks to our partners. Thanks and huge thanks to everyone for tuning in and for interacting with our really kind of engaging poll. So thank you for sharing all those details. If lots of more questions, I'll try and go through the questions, and if I can come back on a few of them or all of them, and maybe I might be able to pass them on to Barbara as well that she didn't get to answer there, I will certainly do that. Our next webinar, we're looking at July 9th for that, lunchtime. So give you plenty of space to have a little bit of a relax and a rest from Zoom, hopefully. So thanks to everyone again. Thanks for interacting. Thanks to our partners, and thanks to Barbara. Stay safe, stay connected with your loved ones, and we'll talk to you again soon.